Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. Today's Tuesday, March 4th. I'm Dan Moulthrop. I'm the Chief Executive here. It's so great to see all of you here. Thank you for being a part of our forum today. Our conversation today comes at a point when economic uncertainty looms large over our nation and the globe. A barrage of tariffs and counter-tariffs have just been announced, probably more this morning. The cost of living and inflation remains stubbornly high, and here in Cleveland, as in many communities across the country, our neighbors continue to grapple with rising housing costs. I think each of us here can agree that the need to create and preserve more affordable homes is a top priority both here and across the nation. With that in mind, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers here today, who will talk more about the housing challenges facing Cleveland, the state of Ohio, and the nation, and practical solutions to bring down escalating housing costs. Shaun Donovan is the president and CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, a national leader in housing and community development. Mr. Donovan has a 30-year career in public service, having served in President Barack Obama's cabinet from 2009 to 2014 as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. As HUD Secretary, he was deeply involved in the recovery from the 2008 housing and foreclosure crisis. Donovan then went on to serve as director in the U.S. Office of Management and Budget from 2014 to 2017. Prior to his federal roles, he was commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Small little job there. Also joining us on stage, Republican State Senator Michele Reynolds. She is serving her first term representing the 3rd District in Ohio, which includes communities just south and west of Columbus. Senator Reynolds holds multiple committee assignments, including chair of the Housing Committee, vice chair of the Workforce Development Committee. In addition to her public service, Senator Reynolds is a 3rd-generation business owner and nonprofit CEO. Michelle Jarboe is moderating our conversation today. She's a reporter at News 5 Cleveland covering business growth and development. You have followed her career for a long time, I'm sure, when she was also at Crane's Cleveland Business and the Plain Dealer before that as enterprise reporter covering real estate and economic development. Before we get started, a couple of quick reminders. You can text your questions to 330-541-5794, and City Club staff will work it into the Q&A portion of the program. And also another reminder that the ideas expressed here are those of the speakers and not those of the City Club, IdeaStream, or our sponsors. Members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Shaun Donovan and Senator Reynolds.
Okay, so I have way more questions than we can possibly get to, so let's jump right in. And I want to start with a table setting question, just kind of laying out the state of the problem. So we hear people use the phrase housing crisis all the time. What does that look like on the ground? And Senator Reynolds, what did you hear about during your recent listening tour across Ohio?
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for having me here today. It's good to be back in Cleveland with all of you. A lot of you I was able to meet when I came here last year for the Senate Select Committee on Housing when we toured the entire state and did a deep dive to listen to what are truly the issues that we're facing here in Ohio. And indeed, we surely have a crisis. We know that there's a lot of different definitions floating around about what is affordable housing, but quite simply, affordable housing is a home that someone can afford with their income. And so we know also that about 45% of Ohioans are actually cost burdened by housing. What's normal by HUD definition is to be able to spend up to 30% of your income on housing. However, 45% of Ohioans are spending between 30 to over 50% on housing. So that truly is a crisis. So the question then becomes, what is it that Ohio should be doing about that, and what role do we play as a state in trying to solve that problem? And it's only getting worse. It's getting very pervasive. we've heard lots of things on the ground, and it's the tale of two states. Ohio has a housing problem in our urban corridors like the city of Cleveland and Columbus and Dayton and Cincinnati, because these are high growth areas. We're bringing lots of jobs to the state of Ohio. But also, we have a very real problem in our urban and our rural areas, because those are slower growth areas, but we need infrastructure to be able to make housing affordable there too. So it's quite a crisis. We can't solve it with a silver bullet, but we are committed to making housing a priority in Ohio.
And then, Shaun, I'm sure what you're seeing across the country is much the same, maybe exacerbated in certain markets.
Yeah, and maybe as the senior citizen among this group, you heard in the introduction, I've been doing this work for 3 decades, and what I will say is I've never seen it this bad. And that's true of the numbers, whether you think about the biggest rent increases we've ever seen, the biggest housing price increases we've ever seen. We have a record number of our neighbors sleeping on the streets and in shelter right now. Homelessness is up 30% in this country over the last 2 years. Think about that, 30% in 2 years. So all the numbers will tell you that. But what is really different, I think, than anything I've seen in my career is not just the depth of the crisis, but the breadth of the crisis. It is everywhere. It is increasingly impacting middle-class families. It's urban, it's rural, it's tribal. It is everywhere in our country. And that, I think, is fundamental. And you can talk about that. If you're an economist, you now understand that housing is hurting our economic growth as a country in a way that we've never seen before. One of the hallmarks of our economy has been we're a very mobile people, right? We kind of sell our houses easily and move to where the jobs are. That is not happening in the way it has historically. And part of what that means is that we are beginning to compound our civic crisis in this country because of a housing crisis. What do I mean by that? More and more, if our politics are dividing along economic and educational lines, and low-income people can't move to where jobs are and opportunity are, increasingly what we're seeing is that we're dividing in our communities along political lines too. And we bemoan our partisanship in this country, but housing is part of that crisis as well. We've never been more geographically politically polarized than we are today since the Civil War. The communities we live in, we tend to live with people who see our political beliefs, and that compounds our bubbles in ways that I think has real civic implications for our country as well. And so it is a real crisis in a way that we haven't seen. But what I would say, and maybe to quote my old boss, President Obama, a crisis is a terrible thing. It is also a terrible thing to waste. And what is different right now is the breadth of this crisis. And what that means is Republicans and Democrats, rural and urban, are kind of waking up to this crisis in a way that is scrambling the politics around it, I think, in ways that are quite powerful. And I think what that means is there is a moment of opportunity for us right now to do something about this, and to do it at the federal level, despite all the headwinds we have, but also at the state and local level. And just to close, I've never seen housing come up 5 times in a presidential debate before. That happened last year. I've never seen 30-plus governors talk about housing affordability in their State of the State addresses. That happened last year. So the question is, what are we going to do? As the senator said, what are we going to do with this crisis, and how do we turn it into opportunity?
So I feel like there is tremendous bipartisan agreement on the problem, and then it's when you get into the solutions there are a lot of divides. I think property taxes are a prime example of that with property tax relief, and I know I get phone calls almost every day from people who are trying to figure out how to manage their rising property taxes, who are afraid of being displaced from their homes. Senator Reynolds, I know that this has been an issue of focus for you. What are the odds the General Assembly is going to actually take something up and run with it this year?
So property taxes is obviously a very complicated issue, and it's a huge issue that's impacting probably 80% of this room, if not, I mean, if you own a home, it is impacting you greatly. And it is a very complicated issue, and one that I definitely want to see the General Assembly tackle this GA to get something done. But having said that, because it is very complicated, we don't want to oversimplify. I don't want to oversimplify the problem, because there are smart people in the room, especially from our county auditors, that understand the metrics and the equation of how we got here, why we got here, how we assess values, and what that numerator is that gets us to the problem that we have now. So we have to understand as legislators, first of all, how does this math even work to get us to this problem, so that we can break it down and actually pass laws that can help us fix it. So until we actually can fix it, the only thing we can do at this point is maybe Band-Aid it. So you will see a series of bills. Mine is one of them. Senate Bill 42 is a bill that I sponsored not only in the last GA toward the end, but this GA, and it's already had sponsor testimony. And that is to set up what we call residential stability zones, so that we can work alongside our local governments, because a lot of these problems are very local. And we don't want to sit in a seat of paternalism and tell our local communities what they're going to do, because first of all, that doesn't work here in Ohio. We very much regard home rule. However, this allows a local community, a local city, to be able to identify where they're having the most problems and what population that they're serving of their constituents that are having the most problem as it relates to being displaced from their homes because of property taxes, and be able to make that a stability zone so that they can actually alleviate some of that tax burden so that they can stay in their homes and not lose them. And it also then preserves being able to fund our schools, because that's also something that's connected to property taxes. So you go tinkering with one thing, then all of a sudden the schools aren't getting enough funding, which they already aren't getting enough funding. And you start tinkering with this, and now all of a sudden housing falls out the bottom, because you can't support the housing trust fund that's actually helping with housing supports and things like that. So you have to make sure that you're not doing these things in a vacuum, but you're doing them interconnected, very deliberate, very intentional, but you have folks in the room that can break it down to us, because I didn't go to school for math. I mean, I went to school for a lot of things, but I didn't go to school for math. I'm a social science major, and so you have to really break that down in layman's terms. Now, I'm a visionary, and I think in big concepts, and I say, okay, if this is the problem, then let's cut across the field to the solution. So Senate Bill 42 is just one bill that is looking at helping our local governments help address property taxes in their local communities. We would love to have your support at the State House to come out and support that if you believe that that is something that's going to work in your community. But those are the type of solutions that we need until we actually fix the root causes of the problem. We need to at least give some immediate relief right now.
Maybe just to add one piece on this, I completely agree with the Senator that there are ways to protect the most vulnerable people, seniors, low-income folks, and doing that in a targeted way makes sense. There's also, I think, an increasing level of creativity we're seeing around the country, innovation at county level, city level, even at state level, that is saying, if you, as a developer of housing, set aside a certain number of units for restricted rents, to do it in a way that can really make a difference long term, even permanently affordable. We're seeing more and more jurisdictions starting to experiment with those kind of programs. And it can be a powerful way both to get investment in existing housing, but also to get new construction of affordable housing done as well. And that's an important part of the equation too.
Yeah, I'm curious, you both mentioned things that local communities are doing. What can local communities, cities, suburbs, rural communities do to make this easier? Is there any low-hanging fruit improvements you see out there?
So I would say that our local communities have a lot of great ideas. The challenge is that they're not necessarily incentivized to do anything as it relates to housing and the housing ecosystem. They're already struggling because of inflationary pressures of just maintaining what they have now. And then we're coming up against, of course, NIMBY, not in my backyard. So a lot of local residents, I mean, they may say, yeah, we want housing, but when the rubber meets the road and you get down into those communities, they really don't want it there. They want you to do that in Columbus, do that in Cleveland, but don't touch my community. And they're not incentivized to do anything, because more housing means more people in our schools, more police safety forces that we have to protect people, more fire services, and all of that, and it's very, very expensive. So, but the local communities have really good ideas about what they could do if money were not a barrier. So one of the things that I believe that the state can do, and a role that the state can play, is to look at how we support our local communities through our local government fund. Right now, it's about a 1.7% of our GRF, our general revenue fund, is what cities get to support, that's their revenue to support their city services. But if we look at making the local government fund at the 1.7% a floor, but then having what it used to be, which was, and I know that they'll get me for saying, I mean, it's 3.6 something percent is what it used to be before Governor Kasich. If we make that a ceiling, then we can make that an elective share that local governments could go through their counties, and the counties could apply to us as the state, and they could say, you know what, with that floor, we are willing to, we can incentivize housing. They would get maybe a 1%, 2%, or 3% bump up of their current local government allocation, but they have to invest in some sort of housing development that meets their local needs. So that way, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Every community knows what they need, whether it's rental assistance, whether it's property tax assistance, whether it's building more infrastructure for more housing, infill housing development, whatever it is that they need, they can take that bonus to be able to do it. And then you're driving competition even between the other cities, because some communities may say, we don't want anything here. We like our community the way it is, and we don't want nothing. And then another community said, we're all for it, and we want that local government fund bonus. We're willing to make the investments to our ecosystem to get all the things that we need here to improve our housing stock and do all the things we need to do. And then it drives competition in the marketplace. And so I agree with you that, you know, it's the what we agree on, and we should not politicize this issue. Look at this room. We're actually all coming together because of this crisis. So this should not be a political situation. We should not be politicizing housing. This is a conversation that is more of a humanitarian crisis. When we make it a Democrat agenda or a Republican agenda, we are missing the very essence of what it means to be a human being that deserves to have an affordable and accessible and safe place to live. And so this is something that we can all agree on. That's why I believe you're seeing bipartisan support. But we need to be able to know what is our role in this space and how do we support our local communities, because housing truly is a very local issue, and we got to get to the root causes of that.
So building on that, one of the root causes of the crisis we have is we don't have enough housing in this country. And we at Enterprise think we're about 7 million short, units short nationally. Here in Ohio, for every 100 families that need housing, there are about 40 affordable units for them. So huge mismatch. And increasingly, it's something Democrats and Republicans agree on, is that we make it too hard, right? And yes, there is a lot of NIMBYism out there, but the YIMBY movement, the yes in my backyard movement, is growing. And it's really interesting to see the politics of this play out. I went to visit the governor of Montana fairly recently. This is a far-right Republican who was reelected in a landslide. Walked into his office, more dead animals than I've ever seen in one room in my life. But he just eliminated single-family zoning and most parking requirements in the state of Montana. And I said to him, to your point, Governor, what's the politics for you of like overruling all your mayors and county commissioners? He said, this is a freedom agenda. Property owners should be able to do what they want with their properties, right? So that's one end. You have racial justice advocates who have been working for decades to open the suburbs, right? You have housing advocates who fundamentally understand. We have developer partners in this room who, have lots more gray hair than me, having worked for decades to try to get housing built in certain areas, right? And so I think we have a moment of opportunity, and it's really interesting to see the way this is starting to play out. And it's not just talk, right? We have state legislatures and we have local communities that have passed bills that are really starting to move the needle. We just did a study. I don't know, let's get wonky here. Who knows what an ADU is, an accessory dwelling unit, right? We worked with the city of Los Angeles to pass ADU legislation. And we just did a study of how many ADUs have been built the last few years in Los Angeles. If every place in the country did just what LA has done, we would have over 9 million new units of housing in this country. So these are differences, and this is not the like, we're gonna build a skyscraper next to your single family home, right? This is not social. This is gentle density, it's parking. There's a huge set of things that can happen. And what's interesting about the politics of this, we're seeing more and more local legislators who are telling their state representatives or their governors, look, I'm not going to support this politically, but please make me do it, right? So you're seeing more and more states, Republican states and Democratic states, taking steps on this. And this is an area where I'm really hopeful that there's, as you said, Senator, bipartisan support. And there's so many different aspects of it. I mean, just an example I know you're passionate about, we have a huge faith-based development initiative at Enterprise. There are congregations across Cleveland, across Ohio, that would love to be contributing to their community, help stabilize the finances of their congregation, build some housing, build affordable housing. But too often there are restrictions that stand in their way on zoning or regulatory. Lots of states are putting that into the kind of reforms that we're seeing. Office conversions, right? We just did a study that showed just 10% of the vacant mall space in the country could be 700,000 units of housing. So there are lots of opportunities in this space of how we rethink our communities, especially after a period where shopping has fundamentally changed in our country, where we work and where we live has fundamentally changed. There are opportunities here that I think are quite bipartisan, and even with a Trump administration that's been hostile to a number of the things that we're trying to do, this is an area where federal land or regulatory reform or other things could be really helpful.
Senator Reynolds, I know you have a strong interest, well, a strong faith background, but also a strong interest, in my understanding, in working with churches to unlock underused land. Can you talk about that a little?
Sure. So that interest, first, I'll just back up a little bit. So my background and how I even come to this problem is because as a third-generation business owner, my grandparents started group homes when I was 4 years old for the developmentally disabled. So I grew up in the family business and worked with individuals who were marginalized and decided, at a very early age that this was a group that I was passionate about, and I wanted to spend my career helping people who, quite frankly, couldn't help themselves. And I found myself after, going to college, lots of different colleges, and also then getting a real estate license. In around 2001, I started working for a local halfway house in Columbus, Ohio. And in that space, I realized that there was a real big problem, and the problem was that this organization was taking in individuals who were formerly incarcerated and helping them transition into the community, but a lot of times there wasn't enough room. There just wasn't enough room at the halfway house for individuals who were formerly incarcerated to have a place to stay. So what did they do? A lot of them were homeless and living on the streets. And to me, that was it just hit me to my core. Because I not only saw that as, it pulled on my heartstrings, but I saw it as a public safety issue that people are just living on the streets, and it's just not a good situation, but it's not a safe situation for any of us. And so the local shelter system, they were overcrowded, as you will, but they were designed for chronically homeless people. They were not designed to be a reentry solution. So people were going to the shelter because they couldn't get into the halfway house, and then they were living on the street. And so at that point, I decided, I'm gonna do what I love to fight what I hate. And I hate homelessness with a passion. That's just a burden that God gave me. I hate homelessness. And so what I decided, thank you. but I love real estate. And so I decided to take one of my first property on Long Street in Columbus, and I started a transitional housing program. I wasn't funded. I did this as a passionate landlord for 4 years, and I went from one house to 4 houses in just a couple of months because the need was so high. And this was back in 2001. This was 24 years ago. And from that time to this time, 4 years later, the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections came to me and they said, this is a private solution to a public problem, and we need more private landlords that care about this. It's not just a DRC, Department of Rehab and Correction problem. It's not just a state problem. It's all of our problem. And so they said, we're going to put together a request for proposal. If you would think about becoming a nonprofit organization and starting, doing what you're doing now, we would like to fund something like this. So I did that. Started Nothing into Something Real Estate, the exit program, ex-offenders in transition, and started with just 15 beds. From that time to this time, we've housed over 5,000 people. We've expanded to 5 cities across Ohio: Columbus, Akron, Mansfield, Chillicothe, and Cincinnati. Tried to come to Cleveland, but it was just tough to come here because of the politics. It just really tough. But we've housed a lot of people, and we've seen a lot of success stories. And then that's what actually took me to the State House. So I come to this problem from a very bottom-up approach, from being that provider, from being in the trenches, from seeing the destitution of people that are just, without hope. And then coming up with real solutions. So as a faith-based leader now, I am a pastor's wife. My husband's a pastor. We pastor a church. And we ourselves own property and have used that property to be a solution for housing. And so I have a bill that is in draft right now called the Promised Land. And the Promised Land is a bill that actually helps faith-based and nonprofits, whether you're faith-based or not, but if you own property that you would like to use for a housing solution, we want to be able to extend Opportunity Zone benefits to those designated faith-based and nonprofit organizations for the purposes of land so that they can attract and get all of the same benefits that you would from a federal or a state standpoint of tax incentives, so that out-of-town or just private equity could actually invest in those. And then, of course, enterprise can help structure those deals. But we would like those nonprofits to be able to determine what type of problem they want to solve in housing. Is it disabled veterans? Is it reentry? Is it recovery homes, maternity homes? Whatever it is, and it could actually help fund their mission as well so that they can do what they love to fight what they hate.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question here quickly before we transition to the audience Q&A. Ohio has seen a lot of bulk buying of single-family homes for rental since the Great Recession. Is that something government should restrict? And if so, how?
So I have some strong thoughts about this. I am a big leverage person. Right now, I just don't, there's not enough money to go around. The government they do 2 things well. They either solve a problem or create one. So, if we think...
Sometimes both.
Yeah, sometimes both at the same time. So my thought is, instead of running investors out of town and just saying, you can't buy here, we're going to tax the hell out of you and drive you out of town so that you can't invest here, I don't necessarily think that that's the answer. But I do think that if you leverage them as being a part of the solution, then we're getting somewhere. So I have this concept of home equity sharing. If you can't own the dream, you should share the dream. And if you could partner an investor who's already buying up in a neighborhood with a qualified home buyer who may not have enough of a means to be able to buy like an entire house, because right now the market's just so upside down that if I have $150,000 that I'm qualified for, what am I going to buy? Really, what are you going to buy? But if I have Shaun, who's an investor, who also pairs my $150,000 with $100,000, and I own 55% of the property, and he owns 45% of the property, And for him, it's an investment. But now he has not a tenant, but someone who has skin in the game, someone who's going to take care of the property. Now we're increasing home ownership. But we also have, when the property does appreciate and we go to sell, he gets whatever it appreciated at 45% and I get 55%, or when it appreciates, I can buy Shaun out. Now I think that we can leverage him to be a part of the solution. So, some out-of-town investors may be hairy, scary, and may be buying up things and being a problem in our community. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about, on average, if someone has some private equity that they can put skin in the game and be a private solution to a public problem, what's wrong with that?
Shaun, what do you think of that?
So this is an area we're seeing a lot of activity around the country, a lot of focus on this at the federal level, during the Biden administration, at the state and local level. And what I would say is, one of the fundamental things that's changed in real estate is that with all of the technology tools, with a huge amount of cash built up in these investors, it's become a really uneven fight. If you're an individual family who has to go qualify for a mortgage and wants to put a bid on a property, it's gone by the time you can actually run through that process. So I think in a society where we're not going to ban investors, we are a capitalist country, and we're going to remain that way. But I do think there are things that communities can do, like waiting periods, right? Where you can say, give somebody time who's an individual buyer to purchase property, to go get their mortgage. There are solutions like that I see more and more communities adopting that I think can help to kind of make it a fairer fight. I would also just say, in Cleveland, in a range of places around the country, we do need more housing, and we've been working with investors who will build to rent, right? Rather than come in and buy existing housing, do new construction, add to the housing stock, single-family rental, it can be part of the solution. But I can't leave this without going back to the conversation just a moment ago about homelessness, because I too hate homelessness. Actually, what started me working in housing was watching more and more people, more and more of my neighbors fall into homelessness in New York City as I was growing up. I volunteered in a shelter in college. I went to work for the National Coalition for the Homeless. And I think the thing that is so inspiring about your story, Senator, about the work that I've seen, I was just visiting with my amazing enterprise team a property called Lotus yesterday, which is helping young people who have come out of foster care. The chances, if you are aging out of foster care, that you end up on the streets is almost 50%. Think about that. And we are building supportive housing, this amazing property we visited yesterday, that has engaged those young people in designing their own building and has given them real hope of a future and their own home for many of them that have never had them, right? What I want to say is, at a time when we've had record rates of homelessness, this is a solvable problem. During the Obama administration, I led the nation's strategy on homelessness. Senator, I know your mom served in the Air Force. Veterans were almost twice as likely to fall into homelessness when we started. We rallied bipartisan support. We built a huge amount of supportive housing. And we ended veteran homelessness in 100 cities and states in this country. We dropped it by 50%. Nationally. We cut it in half. If we can take the politics out of this and do what Cuyahoga County has done in Cleveland, there is one of the more remarkable partnerships around homelessness where we are sitting today that has been incredibly effective. And what that's meant is homelessness is still down in this county from where it was 10 years ago, when it's dramatically up everywhere else. And that's because you all have figured out how to work together and pursue the right solutions. Homelessness is a housing problem, and it is a solvable problem.
Well, I have a million more questions I could ask, but we're going to shift now to the audience Q&A. So for our live stream audience, I'm Michele Jarboe, a reporter at News 5 Cleveland and moderator for today's conversation. Today, we're talking about the housing challenges facing Cleveland, the state of Ohio, and the nation. Joining me on stage here is Shaun Donovan, President and CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, and Republican State Senator Michele Reynolds. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, as well as people joining us via live stream and cityclub.org. If you'd like to text a question for our speakers, please text it to 330-541-5794, and the City Club staff will try to work it into the program. May we have the first question, please?
Yes, good afternoon. We have a text question. I work in the older adult independent living affordable housing space. Residents who need to transition to the next level of care is the most difficult aspect of our job. The Ohio Housing Finance Agency created an affordable assisted living tax credit add-on, but it is not enough. What can be done to ensure the creation of affordable assisted living?
So I guess I'll take that question. I know that currently through our Ohio Housing Trust Fund, which is a vehicle that was created to actually help with some of those housing supports, recently we've seen that it has not been able to be fully funded because the source of those funds actually comes from transaction fees as it relates to like mortgages and transfer fees. And with inflation, we just have not been able to increase that allocation, but we should. And so that's something that in our next budget, I'm asking for an allocation that will backstop that to make sure that we have the amount of resources, at least in that Ohio Housing Trust Fund, to be able to make those investments that we need to make in our local communities, especially for our low-income residents.
It's one of the things that Ohio has shown real leadership on is to have a state housing trust fund, to have a state low-income housing tax credit. And I think we've seen this around the country. As costs have gone up, as the housing crisis has gotten worse, those funds have not kept up. And so I think this is incredibly important leadership on the senator's behalf to say, we should be doing more and looking to increase the resources there. The other side of the equation is the service funding. And we see this in supportive housing. This is kind of the secret sauce that makes supportive housing work. It also, seniors are the fastest growing part of our homeless population around the country. And we need to be doing a lot more on the service side. What's interesting about this is the best studies have showed that by increasing the amount of service funding available, by creating options that are affordable assisted living instead of forcing folks into nursing homes or other more expensive solutions, we can actually save lives but also save money at the same time on this. And so I think the most innovative states and communities are really looking at this as the way of the future, is to do more to provide either scattered site services or affordable assisted living as a way to go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And just to follow up on that question, that was an excellent question. Appreciate the work at the State House around the homestead exemption and how that would impact older adults. So I really want to thank you all for your work on the last question. My question is, there has been a lot of conversation today about the role of the federal government. And we know that the State of the Union is tonight. And so my question is, if you could give one advice to President Trump, what would you say and why?
Who wants to jump in on that first?
I mean, I guess I would say housing is a priority. I mean, it's definitely a priority. It's not something that we should draw back on. It's something that we need to take. I mean, the numbers don't lie. The numbers are what the numbers are. And there are real stories, real people behind these stories and statistics. And so I think that we can talk about, how we can do it and how we can do it smart. Just because we've always done it a certain way doesn't mean that's the way that we need to continue to do it. So I can appreciate that we've had, years and different administrations have had different iterations of how to do housing. But we live in a different time, and so maybe there are some things that we can do differently. Like, for instance, in Ohio, we have a AAA credit score, bond rating, what have you. I hear this all the time. Well, we should be looking at our treasury and how we can leverage our balance sheet to be able to do something with that, because I know that with that sort of good credit, we should be able to create money that we can then find to solve some of our problems. So I'm saying that as long as we agree that, yes, housing is a priority and we should be doing something, now we can talk about what that something is. We can use technology. We now have 3D printing. We have manufactured housing. We have modular housing. We can increase the production of housing cheaper and deploy it faster. These are the conversations we need to be having, but to ignore it is not the right answer. We cannot do that, and we realized that in Ohio. We didn't even have a committee that dealt with housing until last General Assembly, and it's because I just jumped up and down and said, we gotta be focused on this issue. So I just believe that we have to, continue to yield our voices and let everybody know that housing is a priority, and this is not something that we can retreat, and it's not part of the agenda. It is the agenda.
Shaun, do you have feedback on that?
Yeah, I would say two things. The first thing I would say is, Mr. President, housing got you elected. And, we talk about inflation being the driving issue in this election. Let's be clear. Our inflation problem, especially over the last 2 years, was a housing problem. And so if you are going to live up to those that elected you, you have to do something about this problem. The other thing I would say is, the first month of this administration has been all about what they're against. And my question is, what are you for? What are you going to do to actually try to solve the problems that got you elected? And I think that is what we need to see. And there is lots of opportunity there. I've talked about the bipartisanship. The only other thing I would say, and this comes from having worked in DC for many years, there is more than one branch of government. And it's hard to remember that given the news of the last month. But we have an incredibly closely divided Congress that is about to take on a huge tax bill. I think there remains a very good chance that we could see as much as a 50% increase in our single most important tool across this country to build affordable housing, the low-income housing tax credit. We could see opportunity zones turned into a tool that could actually help build more housing and revitalize communities. The new markets, there's a whole range of solutions on the tax side that we are very focused on. And part of the reason I'm focused on it, just one more story to tell you in my travels. I was in Boise, Idaho last summer. We do a lot of work with tribes around the country. We had a tribal housing conference in Boise. And I went and spent an hour with Mike Crapo, Senator Crapo from Idaho, who is now chair of the Finance Committee. So he is leading for the Senate all of the negotiations on tax reform. And I had all my talking points ready. I was ready to convince him that the housing crisis was the number one. Before I'd said a word, he said to me, Shaun, every single town hall meeting I go to around Idaho, housing is the number one issue. We are going to do something on housing in the Congress, right? So I think we need to be focused, yes, on what the administration is doing, but we also have to remember that for the funding of this country, for the tax reform that we're going to see, it is incredibly important that members of Congress understand what is happening on the ground and the deep impact that this housing crisis is having.
I just want to add, so, a lot of times when we're talking about housing, interchangeably, and we've done it all day, all morning, we say housing and then we say affordable housing. And so that's synonymous with low-income housing. And that's not necessarily, and so a lot of people, when they hear affordable housing, they're thinking, oh, we're talking about low-income housing, and so there are some people that they're just disinterested in that conversation. But when we're talking about housing and us needing more housing, we're talking about, even from a workforce standpoint, which is something that even the business community now can get, on board with. We're talking about housing because homes are where jobs go to at night. So now when we make an economic development and an economic conversation, now we're getting more people's attention. So I think one of the things is that, there has to be some sort of value proposition in this conversation. It can't just be, we're talking two different languages here. So when I'm talking to my Republican counterparts, there are times when I am right-sizing policy because I know what is going to be the phrases that pay, but I know what they care about. I know what we care about as being conservatives. But then there's other times when we're having a conversation and it just seems like it's falling on deaf ears because we're talking about something that doesn't necessarily apply to the greater populace. So I think that one of the things we have to do is level set the conversation and say, what are we really talking about here? And why do we need more housing? If we have more housing, it's going to become more affordable because you will have more in the marketplace, supply and demand. So we have to get on board with that. And I think that if I were to be able to talk to the president and say, do you agree that housing, we have a lack of housing, and then we're on the same page. Okay, now how do we solve that problem? And so that way we can solve all of the other related problems as it relates to it. But to just throw around this terminology is where I think we've lost a lot of people because it's just been like, okay, you're talking about those people. And I'm just being honest.
Let's get to the next question.
Hi, Danielle Acosta with DNA Rising. Our nonprofit we basically renovate bridge housing for single moms coming out of homelessness. But at the same time, I'm a homeowner, but I'm also an investor, a realtor, and I represent investors. And so my question, just as a follow-up, regarding the whole tax increase here in Cuyahoga County, my clients, myself personally, our taxes almost doubled, but also my clients who are great rental home owners, excellent, landlords. They are not slumlords. They're not the evil investors, but they're not, they're not local. And so one of my clients got his tax bill is actually more than doubled on a quadruplex, a very nice quadruplex that he's maintaining and keeping well. And so my question is, how do you help people that are not from the area? There's like this mystery formula that I feel like is not openly disclosed as to how, and he's like, well, is it just based on market value? The prices rise and then they just double my taxes. And so what is this mystery formula that we don't know? I know it's some market value and it's supposed to be some levies and some, but it's an urban area of Cleveland. It's not a suburb, but his taxes more than doubled. And so he now is facing the situation where he's got to raise rent or he will be negative cash flow. So how does that work? How do I help my clients and myself understand this kind of secret formula of how they just kind of hike the taxes?
And I think that kind of points to a bigger question about what supports are there for mom and pop landlords out there, because though we do have bulk investors in the market, actually most of the landlords here are mom and pops and costs are going up on them.
Yeah, so that's a very real situation that's going on. And as I alluded to earlier, is that there is this metric, if you will, that was written in code a very long time ago, but it has not been adjusted now with inflation. And so with using that historical, I'm just trying to bring it down to layman's terms the way I understand it.
That's what I need.
It has not
Layman's
adjusted
terms.
with the times we're living in. So now it's just out of whack, but it's so intricate because it's the way we use that to even assess property values. But when you start tinkering with it, you start now tinkering with school systems and you start tinkering with a lot of different things. So we have to get to the root of the problem, and it takes actuaries, it takes county auditors, it takes people who tax professionals to be able to break this down in a way that everyday people that are elected like me can understand, so that we can then say, okay, what do you recommend and what is a good, a solution to this problem? So it's not just property tax we're dealing with, but we're also looking at how are we funding our schools? Maybe we shouldn't be funding our schools with property taxes. We're having those conversations. So now everything's on the table. The same way we used to do things, or it's not the same way we need to continue to do things, obviously, because it's out of whack. And so that's why we're having these conversations. And I appreciate what you said about the mom and pop, because I mean, that is the backbone of our economy as small business. And a lot of times when we think about out-of-town investors, we're thinking about those that just come and buy up in our neighborhoods and they leave us high and dry and all of that. But at the end of the day, we want, people also think that landlords, they are raising their rents because they want to. No, the money, I mean, these property taxes are real. And somebody has to pay for that. And so now the renters are experiencing that. So it's not that you have landlords that are just so bad and they're just raising the rents. What happens when you cap rents? Well, that now if the landlord decides, well, this is not, something that I want to be in this space anymore, and they get out of being landlords, that doesn't necessarily automatically, I think we make the assumption that if an investor doesn't buy, then somebody else will. That doesn't mean that they can or that they can afford to, because the market is still the market. It's still very, very expensive to buy. Do they have the opportunity? Yes, to buy. So we need to look at an intermediate solution, something that brings both parties to the table and say, look, you will not buy up in this neighborhood unless you buy with a qualified homeowner, because we're only going to allow you to buy so many. So we can maybe cap that or incentivize that and say, here's some tax credits or something to make these shared arrangements, but you're not going to just go and buy up in a neighborhood and just, exacerbate this neighborhood. You're not going to do that. But instead of just running you out of town, you can be a part of the solution. So we do need to support our landlords. It's not always about, they just want to increase rent. That's not true. You just gave a case in point of what's really happening, but they are also supplying a need. Another, along the same lines are Airbnbs. A lot of people may think, okay, short-term rentals, how is that a part of the housing ecosystem? But it really, really is. It's a part of the housing conversation, because sometimes people are coming here, there's not enough housing, and they're staying in an Airbnb just to be able to work. And so we can look at a home-to-work program where Airbnb homeowners, mom and pop businesses, can actually become, the kind of the framework or the groundwork for workforce housing. They can be mini developers to develop that workforce housing. They can get more houses and have more people be able to stay there on more of a short or intermediate term, so that they can actually have more workforce housing to work until we've solved this problem. So we need everything on board, especially our mom and pops.
Two quick things just to add. There are a lot of jurisdictions that have caps in place that will only allow property taxes to rise by a certain amount. So let's say your assessment goes up by 12%, it will cap the percentage that your property taxes can go up each year, and that's a solution that I've seen work in a lot of places. But I would also say this larger point about small landlords is incredibly important, and we were founded, Enterprise, 42 years ago. We've now helped create and preserve 1 million units of housing around the country. We were founded to basically provide what I like to say, money and knowledge to local community organizations, starting with nonprofits, but we work with a lot of small owners and landlords. And there's an enormous amount that we do at Enterprise, but that we can do broadly to try to support, not just on property taxes, but what's the funding you can get to mitigate lead paint? What's the funding that you could get to replace your wiring and put solar panels or a heat pump in your property? How do you deal? A huge issue around the country is property insurance, right? We've seen it double or triple in places around the country. So all of those things are issues that we work on to provide technical assistance and help directly to preserve that housing, but also we work on it at a statewide level. Insurance is generally led by state insurance commissioners. We work on it on the national basis. So we really need to be doing both, helping directly, but also work on the big policy issues that could make it better.
Got a question over here?
Yes, my name is Josiah Quarles. I'm the Director of Organizing Advocacy at Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless. I've heard a lot of conversation on the supply side today, and recognizing that within City of Cleveland, Cleveland was built to be a much larger city than it is. So we actually have a lot of empty spaces, empty houses, and the development that comes in is also a lot of times accompanied with these algorithmic kind of AI property management systems that actually tell landlords to withhold their units so that they manipulate the market to increase rents and in the long term make that more profitability. So my question to you is, I think there are limitations with what we can do on the supply side. What is the appetite for the access side, whether that be source of income protections or fair chance housing ordinance or tenant opportunity to purchase, things that can be put into place to help regulate and put guardrails on the market? Thank you.
So I actually have a bill, Senate Bill 83, this General Assembly, that it takes care of eviction record ceilings. And so, as you know, a lot of people who may get an eviction filed on them, whether or not that eviction sticks, it stays on their record, and that is something that shouldn't be happening because that's creating more barriers in access to housing. So this is to automatically, well, first of all, it's to suppress that does not happen until there's an adjudication. But so it's to take that off the record or not even let it get on the record if there is an eviction filing. Now, if someone gets a bona fide eviction, then yes, it is on your record, just like a credit report. But the fact that you've been filed on and then it's been mitigated through, working with a program or your landlord, you shouldn't have to continue to have that eviction record on there. Also, from an access standpoint, Senate Bill 83 does, it creates a fund for housing defense. So we already have legal aids that we fund, but this is a housing defense fund that can actually help provide support and services to individuals who really need that type of legal defense, whether it's counsel or to help them navigate the eviction or whatever it is from a housing defense standpoint, that there's a fund to help do that in the state of Ohio to help bolster that. Also, we are looking at the Medicaid waiver, so the 1115 waiver that allows us to simply go to the federal government and say we want to exercise that option so that through managed care, that low-income renters and low and moderate income renters who have a managed care plan can actually access those benefits for housing supports. So that's on the access side as well.
So all of that is really important. Just a couple of things I would add. As a country, we have to understand that we can put money into building housing. We can have more low-income housing tax credits. We need more at the State Housing Trust Fund. But all of those are what we call capital tools that can help housing get built. There are millions of families in this country that work full-time and still can't afford just to even pay for what it takes to operate a housing unit, the monthly expenses, right? And so we are always going to need a system that balances those capital tools, investing in building housing, with helping people pay the rent. And we are a country where 1 out of 4 people, 1 out of 4 families that would actually qualify for housing assistance actually gets it. That is not a strategy for solving our housing crisis, right? At the same time, those 25% of the families that are lucky enough to get those housing vouchers, 40% of them can't actually find a unit to rent. Think about that. You win the lottery, you get a housing voucher after waiting years on a list, and then almost half the time you have to turn it back. We have to fix that, and we just went through a period with COVID where we put billions of dollars into emergency rental assistance that was remarkably effective. It's a story we don't tell enough, and we need to learn the lessons about direct rental assistance, making it easier to use those vouchers. And we also have to acknowledge that part of the problem is low-income families, often of color, get discriminated against in the market. And so source of income discrimination is something we are also very supportive of ensuring that we limit. So both of those things, more support, fixing those programs that provide rental support, and then also making sure everyone has an opportunity to use that rental support are things that we work on every day at Enterprise and that we as a country need to do more of.
Thank you so much, Shaun Donovan, Senator Michele Reynolds, and Michele Jarboe for leading the conversation. We really appreciate your wonderful, wonderful work here today. Forums like this one are made possible thanks to generous support from individuals like all of you, and including many of you. You can learn more about how to become a guardian of free speech at cityclub.org. We'd also like to extend a special note of gratitude to our friends at Enterprise Community Partners for their programming partnership today. Additionally, please join me in recognizing guests at tables hosted by Bellwether Enterprise, CHN Housing Partners, Citizens, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority, Eden Incorporated, Enterprise Community Partners, Famicos Foundation, First Suburbs Consortium, First Year Cleveland at Case Western Reserve University, Frontline Service Habitat for Humanity, Harvard Community Services Center, Huntington Key Bank, the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, Metro West Community Development, Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, NEOC, Penrose, Warner, and Swayze, Third Federal Savings and Loan, and the YWCA of Greater Cleveland. Yes. Ayana sold some tables, apparently. Just some programs coming up this Friday, an assessment from local GOP leaders on the first 50 days of the Trump administration. On Friday, March 21st, we talk about the state of DEI with Kevin Clayton, Erica Merritt, and Mark Swaim Fox. Thursday, March 27th, Citizens Bank CEO Bruce Von Saun will join us to talk about economic resilience in times of uncertainty. April 1st, we hear from Michelle Rose, the CEO of Northeast Ohio's new workforce organization, Greater Cleveland Works. There's a lot. Hope to see more of you at any of these forums. You can find out more at cityclub.org. Once again, thanks to our panelists and to Michele Jarboe. Thanks also to all of you. The sun is shining, spring's around the corner. This forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
The ideas expressed in City Club forums are those of the speakers and not of the City Club of Cleveland, IdeaStream Public Media, or their sponsors. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.